Hi, I am Anshu. I'm going to be the host for this episode of Spontaneous Order Dialogues, or SO Dialogues as we like to call it here at Center for Civil Society. Today, we have guest Professor Randall G. Holcombe. Now, Professor Randall G. Holcombe is DeVore Moore Professor of Economics at Florida State University. He has held several notable academic positions and served on Florida Governor Jeb Bush's Council of Economic Advisors from 2000 to 2006, and is also past president of the Public Choice Society and the Society for the Development of Austrian Economics. Dr. Holcombe is also the author of 20 books and over 200 academic articles published in academic and various professional journals. So welcome to the podcast, Professor Holcombe.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Right. So for starters, I think, and for the audience at large as well, you've done a lot of work on political capitalism, and in the book by your same name as well, right? So for the audience at large, can you begin by explaining what political capitalism is and how it's also sort of different from other terms like cronyism and corporatism that we used to sort of, speak about similar phenomena?
Yeah, that's a good question, and actually there's a great similarity there. So I don't mind using the term corporatism or crony capitalism or something like that. But the reason that I thought it would be good to have a separate name for that really goes back to the idea of comparative economic systems and maybe the way we were thinking about things in the 20th century. And that's spilled over into the 21st. If you go back to the 20th century, the Cold War era, there were these capitalist democracies on the one side, the socialist dictatorships on the other side. And so there's this, countries could vary in political and economic dimensions. You know, some of them were capitalist, some of them were socialist. But the conventional wisdom was we really didn't have any pure examples on either side. I mean, they were mostly capitalist economies, mostly socialist, but every economy is a mixed economy that's somewhere in between capitalism and socialism. Some are more capitalist, some are more socialist. And I think that taxonomy doesn't fit well with the cronyism, the corporatism, the political capitalism. And so in my book, I argue it's really a different type of economic system. And one thing is, if you move from capitalism to socialism, you're moving from private ownership to government ownership of the means of production. But with political capitalism is based on private ownership of the means of production. So it's not a movement toward socialism, it's private ownership of the means of production. But because of government involvement in the economy, profitability, as you move toward political capitalism, profitability is more due to the government connections, political connections, than to producing goods and services to satisfy consumers.
So essentially it's a distinct system of its own, like you also argue in the book, right?
Yeah, so it's a separate economic system. Probably the best example in any economy of those elements of political capitalism is what President Eisenhower called decades ago the military-industrial complex. I mean, there you have a bunch of private firms, private contractors who are making tanks and aircraft and provisioning the military and so forth, but their only customer is the government. So basically, they're not trying to satisfy consumer needs, but rather find favoritism with the government so they can get the government contracts. And the profit or loss there has nothing to do with satisfying consumer desires. It's how much the government's willing to pay you. So if you get in the good graces of the government, you get the contract. Good example of political capitalism.
I see. You also mentioned in your book and other lectures outside as well that, it's widely criticized, both from the political spectrum of the left and the right. You mentioned how both Joseph Stiglitz and David Stockman, even though they're on two different sides of the political spectrum, they still criticize the same phenomena, right? So given the fact that, even public opinion is so strongly against this sort of a system, why does it still continue to persist, so stubbornly, I'd say, to some extent?
Well, I mean, one reason that it continues to persist is, first of all, most people don't have that much of an interest in making a political statement against it. I mean, if you just look at citizens in general, they're interested in their governments and politics, but really they have more personal interests. They're interested in their job. They want to make money. They want to take care of their family. They want to have time for recreation and to enjoy life. I mean, because when it comes down to it, one individual really can't do much to change the government. So people tend to be, well, the term we use in public choice is rationally ignorant. It doesn't really pay you to be informed because how you vote, your political opinions really aren't going to change things, right? I mean, you show up for an election, candidate A is running against candidate B. Doesn't matter who you vote for, the same person's going to win anyway. So, I mean, that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is, while the general public really isn't very interested, the companies that are getting these government contracts, the companies that are gaining government favoritism, they're very interested.
I see. Given the fact that, so these elites in any sort of a system would always want to maintain their power, right? They'll want to maintain their status, their power and wealth. And given the same, is there sort of a natural tendency for market capitalism to sort of maybe transform into political capitalism?
I think there is that tendency, something we need to try to guard against. But what you see is as political capitalism moves into an economy, it's a cumulative thing. One term we use in public choice is rent seeking. That might be a familiar term, but it's basically, people looking for government favors, people trying to get subsidies or tax breaks, or probably more often regulatory benefits. If you can establish regulations that keep my competitors out, create a barrier to entry. And that's a cumulative process because when those rents are created, they tend to stay for a long time. So this year you have somebody gaining some government favor. That's going to stick around for a long time. Next year you have someone else. Next year you have someone else. So it's a cumulative process that tends to grow. And, it's something that economists have been aware of for a long time. Not necessarily using the term political capitalism, but, I think back, actually before my time, to the 1940s. And Friedrich Hayek wrote his book, The Road to Serfdom. And the road to serfdom, according to Hayek, was socialism. And so he was somewhat pessimistic about the future because of creeping socialism. Around the same time, Joseph Schumpeter wrote his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And again, he had that same pessimism. I mean, he was a big supporter of capitalism, thought it was a great system. But one little passage in his book, he wrote, "Can capitalism survive? No, I don't think it can." That's a quote from Schumpeter. And the reason why he was pessimistic wasn't because capitalism wasn't a great economic system. It was because Schumpeter said the people who have benefited most from capitalism won't stand up to support it. And you see that, when firms lobby the government, they're not saying the free market is great, we want more free market. They go to the government, they say, we want tax benefits, we want tax subsidies, lower our taxes, we want regulatory barriers to entry against our competitors. So Schumpeter said, again, the people who most benefit from capitalism won't stand up to support it. Instead, when they get involved with the government, they're looking for special favors. Now, we're going back a long time. That was the 1940s. Schumpeter was pessimistic. Hayek was pessimistic. And yet here we are, 70 years later, and, we see evidence of those things, but really overall, if you look at the global economy, their pessimism was unwarranted. I mean, the United States, we see some of that. In India, it looks like things are getting better, So there is a tendency for political capitalism to become a bigger and bigger factor in the economy. But fortunately, there are factors that work on the other side. And so some of these pessimistic predictions of Schumpeter, Hayek, haven't come to pass. So I tend to be an optimist. I think there are a lot of factors that are stacked against us. But nevertheless, some people are working to try to overcome that. And maybe if we can win over popular opinion, I try to be optimistic.
Right. I like how you mentioned on Schumpeter's sort of view that maybe capitalists are perhaps the biggest enemies of capitalists themselves, in the sense that maybe socialism isn't really the biggest enemy that we need to tackle, but it's perhaps political capitalism, as you would say. Right. So, presently India has I would say, post-2014, we sort of have a system that's mostly based on the system that you talk about, based on political capitalism. Do you think, for example, any sort of constitutional checks, or do you think anti-corruption measures and these things are effective against rent-seeking and these sort of things from happening?
To a degree, I do. In the book, I look at three factors that might be able to constrain the abuse of power by the powerful. Maybe to take a step back from that. Public policy is determined by an elite few, a political elite. And it really has to be that way because you can't have millions of people getting together to make policy decisions. To use economic jargon, the transaction costs are too high, right? So you're always going to have a small number of people, the political elite, who determine public policy. Those are the legislators, the members of parliament, the lobbyists, the well-connected lobbyists. They're the people who are making public policy. And what we would like to do is to constrain their abuse of the power that they have. One factor that we're up against here is the powerless can't constrain the powerful. Even if the powerless far outnumber the powerless can't constrain the powerful. So how do we constrain them? And so let's look at three methods. First of all, democracy, maybe with democratic government. Secondly, constitutional rules, constitutional constraints. And third, checks and balances in the political system. So if we think about those three factors, I'll take them in turn. Democracy. I think democracy is a great way to run government, so I'm very pro-democracy. But I think it's oversold in what it can do to control the political power of the elite. That there's this romantic notion of democracy that democratic governments are accountable to their citizens and act in the best interest of their citizens. And I think that's a dangerous notion because there's always going to be an elite few who hold political power. And as I said before, the powerless can't control the powerful even if they far outnumber the powerful. So democracy is not a very good constraint on the abuse of power by the people who hold political power. I think it's a great way to choose who holds political power. I'm all in favor of democratic elections, but I don't think we should oversell it as a method of controlling government. Constitutional rules, constitutional constraints. I think it's great to have those constitutional constraints that limit the power of government. And if I can use the United States government as a model, when the Constitution of the United States was written, it gave the federal government certain enumerated powers. It says, here are the powers of the federal government, and restricted the federal government from exercising any powers except those few enumerated powers. So I think that's a great thing, to have limited enumerated powers of government. And this is in direct opposition to that romantic notion of democracy. I mean, the romantic notion of democracy suggests we're a democracy. Government should do what the people want. No, government shouldn't do what the people want. Government should protect people. It should protect their rights. It should establish rule of law and let people live their own lives. And there's where the constitutional constraints come in. Okay, so you say, here are the limited enumerated powers of government, and if the people want something more, no, that's outside the legitimate bounds of government. So constitutional rules, like democracy, they're a good thing. But the problem is you need to be able to enforce them. And so if you just have constitutional rules, but there's no way to enforce them, the political elite are in a position where they can abuse their power. So how do we control the power of the political elite? And there's where a division of power and checks and balances come into play. So if it's the case that a few members of the political elite, those are the people who make public policy. Those are the people who run government. The way we can check their power is by having a division of power so that some in the political elite are able to check and balance the power of others. So democratic government, great thing. Constitutional rules, great, But in order to be effective, you have to have a division of power.
Just because you mentioned about this romantic view of democracy that is out there, so do you think there's a flaw inherent in democratic ideology that sort of leads to this perpetual problem that we have?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there is. If you, and again, I'll apologize to you a little bit for having an American-centric view of things.
Please feel free.
I mean, if you go back to the founding of the United States, and I think it's a good example because it's the first case where you actually have a government that was specifically designed to protect people's rights. So if you look at our Declaration of Independence in the United States, most of it is a list of grievances against the King of England. The Declaration of Independence basically, for most of it, says the King of England has violated our rights in all of these ways. And so it's a list of grievances. And then concludes that because the government of England is violating our rights, we have the right to establish our own government to protect our rights. So if you were to go back to the founding of the United States back in 1776, if you were to just ask somebody off the street, tell me in one word, what's the fundamental principle of our new American government? Probably people would have said liberty. We've designed a government to protect our rights, to protect our liberty. That's the fundamental principle of American government. But fast forward to 2024, and if you were to ask a typical American today, tell me in one word, what's the fundamental principle of American government? I think most Americans would say democracy. We're a democracy. Government ought to do what the people want. So over the centuries, there's been that change in ideology, which I think is potentially dangerous, that you start putting a lot of trust in government. You think government's going to help people out. Government's going to do what's good for me. But then you're giving political power to people who have an incentive to use that power for their own benefit. Not all of them are necessarily malicious, but everybody tends to look at things from their own viewpoint, right? And so
Right.
If you give political leadership unconstrained power, they're going to end up abusing that power.
I see. So you also mentioned about transaction costs some while back right now. And it's kind of interesting how the masses have very high transaction costs as compared to the elites, right? And I think AI is a big thing right now. Everyone is talking about AI at some point of time. Even here at the MPS session of 2024, we had a wonderful session on AI, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think AI sort of is going to affect transaction costs within political markets?
My short answer on that is no. And the reason why is that even if you have some sophisticated AI model that's able to figure out everybody's preferences and so forth, I mean, first of all, it would be a challenge to try to aggregate everybody's preferences. And even, I mean, AI models, they're only as smart as what's input into them. And one problem with political preferences, the way we express them, is we express what we like, but we don't have any way to express the value of particular options to us. I mean, and even if we try to say, you know, here's how much I value this or that or the other, that's what markets do so well, is let people know how much you value things because you pay for them, right? And so when you make a purchase in the market, you're weighing the costs and the benefits. In political decisions, you're not really doing that. I mean, you can say, I prefer A over B, but how much do you prefer A over B? How much would you be willing to pay to get A over B? And we really don't have a good way, even through AI, to figure that out. But there's another problem beyond that, and that is that even if there were some way to do that, people don't have an incentive to figure out their own preferences. This goes back, didn't I already use the term rational ignorance?
Right.
So, okay, so AI somehow can aggregate millions of people's preferences. Great. But when I'm thinking about my preferences, I really don't have an incentive to formulate solid preferences because I'm only one of millions of those preferences. Mm-hmm. See, so with the political elite, you got a small number of people. They actively can influence public policy. The rent seekers can get direct benefits to themselves. But for voters, that they always are going to have the incentive to be rationally ignorant. And so I think it would be tough for AI to make political decisions. Maybe it would be easier to use AI to understand public policies and formulate political preferences, but people don't really have an incentive to do it. So, it seems problematic to me.
We have been using a lot of public choice stuff out here, and you're a public choice economist as well. You've done a hell lot of work on public choice, I'd say. And, it's been several decades since Tulloch and Buchanan developed public choice, and many like yourself have recognized its importance, right? So coming to the 21st century, what sort of research do you think we have as far as public choice is concerned? Are you sort of happy with the way the research direction is heading in public choice? Does it have any new insights to offer to us? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one thing is I'm a little bit disappointed with the lack of influence public choice has had on economics more generally. I think public choice is pretty well established as a separate subdiscipline, but I really think it should be integrated into economics more generally. If you think about the basic idea of public choice, if you go back before public choice, and this even applies today, but welfare economics before public choice, as public choice was being developed, welfare economics, neoclassical welfare economics was being developed at the same time. And, to set aside the too much of the jargon and stuff, basically the way economists were looking at public policy issues is they would figure out, in theory, what would maximize social welfare. So that's, again, I hate to get too technical in the language, but the competitive general equilibrium model shows the optimal allocation of resources. So here's what's optimal. And then what welfare economics has done is looked at all the reasons why the real world economy would fall short of that ideal optimum. Externalities, public goods, monopolies, informational asymmetries. So welfare economics says, here's what the optimum is. And here are all the reasons why the real world economy would fall short of the optimum. But with our models, here we can design policies to get to the optimum. So we're using economic science there. And then the next step is we should have the government do that. And when you take that next step, you're setting aside economic analysis and substituting wishful thinking. You go through all this scientific economics. Here are all the problems. Here's the optimal solution. That's economics. And then you say, so we'll have the government do that. Well, and that's wishful thinking. So what public choice, the basic idea behind it is, let's not just assume government can solve these problems. Let's look at the way government actually works. Because if markets might fail to allocate resources optimally, governments might also fail to allocate resources optimally. So let's see the way government actually works. Let's analyze actual political decision making, and then we can weigh off the alternatives of a real world government against a real world economy. Let's not compare a real world economy with some theoretical ideal you could never reach. Let's compare real world private sector with real world government action. So that's a fundamental principle underlying public choice. So on the one hand, I think public choice has been pretty successful at establishing that idea within the subdiscipline. Right. But on the other hand, I'm disappointed it hasn't spread more into economics more generally. So when we're looking at antitrust policy, let's look at the way government actually operates. And actually that's one area where public choice has made some inroads. When you're looking at macroeconomics, let's look at the way government actually operates. That's one area where government has a big footprint and where public choice has made almost no inroads. So we have these models, aggregate supply, aggregate demand models, and various general equilibrium macro models and so forth. And so, what we do is look at the way the economy works. We derive, here's optimal policy, and then we resort to wishful thinking. So we'll have the government do that. What we should be doing in macroeconomics is saying, let's look at the way government actually operates.
Right.
So public choice is built into all of the subdisciplines in economics. And so that's where I'm a little bit disappointed.
You're very right. We oftentimes do not consider that there's sort of also a discontinuity when it comes to political power, right? As opposed to maybe calculating economic stuff. So that's very right. And I think public choice really does a lot to sort of help us understand those aspects. There's an interesting thing, 17 years back, I think I was back in 2007, under a series titled Who Needs Government? Pirates, Collapsed States, and Possibility of Anarchy. You also mentioned that you sort of agreed with economist Peter Leeson's, who's from George Mason University. Yeah. His view that, no government is better than a bad government. And you also sort of mentioned that, from a policy perspective, maybe anarchism is really impractical, sort of. So now that it's sort of been like 17 years, what do you think of anarchism?
Yeah, my views on that haven't changed. Okay. There's a lot of attractive things about it. And one of the things that the libertarian anarchists have suggested is the private sector can do everything government does, and it can do it better. And so maybe, I'm not willing to argue against that. But the problem is that somehow you have to find a way to protect people's rights in a system like that. And the anarcho-capitalists, Leeson, but also Murray Rothbard, David Friedman, right. Their idea was there would be these private protection firms. And so rather than having government police, you would hire a private protection firm. And you might not need to hire it individually, but maybe if you live in a neighborhood or a building or something, your building would hire the firm. And they would protect your rights. And if there were any disputes, Like maybe your neighbor, you think your neighbor's stolen your bicycle. And the neighbor, no, this is my bicycle. So there's a dispute. And if your neighbor has a different protection firm, well, the protection firms don't want to use up resources battling it out. So the protection firms are going to agree to arbitration. They'll work together to decide whose bicycle that really is, you know. But the problem is those protection firms, in order to be effective, they have to have a comparative advantage in the use of force. And if they have a comparative advantage in the use of force, just like with governments, they might abuse that power, you know. And
Right.
so there's an incentive for those private protection firms to work together to form cartels, you know, like the mafia, right?
Right.
So the mafia guy comes to your business and says, "That's a nice business you have. It would be a shame if anything happened to it, but if you pay us, we'll look after your business.
Right.
And if you don't pay, what do you think is going to happen to your business?" Yeah, the guys who have
Sort
the
of becomes rent extraction again.
yeah. So, so these private protection firms would, I mean, just through the incentives, would develop into little mafias, which could develop into oppressive governments. So that's my skepticism on the orderly anarchy. And, you know, I mean, on one hand, I'm happy to talk about it, but on the other hand, for people who want a more limited government, I think it's counterproductive, really, to argue about those things.
Right.
Because, you know, you maybe bring up a difference between Peter Leese and myself.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, both of us think government is too big. We
Fair.
need to shrink government. So we might argue down at the margins, but as far as what we actually want today, we want the same things.
Right. So in Argentina recently as well, you know, Javier Milei came to power and he became the president. And for a lot of libertarians as well, that's quite a major good sign, I'd say, right? And I think you also wrote a blog for the Independent Institute where you mentioned that it's a good sign that the Libertarian Party sort of came into power. And Javier himself was an economist, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think? Are there some lessons to be learned from that for other countries in the world? Some interesting prospects, maybe?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not too good at forecasting stuff like that, but I think really, I mean, one advantage there is if things get really bad, people are ready for a change.
Right.
So I think, you know, one thing, if you're interested in more limited government, interested in a more libertarian society, if you develop the ideas, so you have the ideas ready and waiting, when the opportunity arises, that's when you can make your move. And we saw that if you go back to the 1970s. You look at the Ronald Reagan in the United States. You look at Margaret Thatcher in Britain. And both of them expressed admiration and building on the ideas of Milton Friedman. So, you know, Friedman, for decades, he's developing his ideas, building those ideas. And then when the time was right, the ideas were there. So, you know, I guess that's for people who are thinking, in my country, I wish we had
Right.
a more libertarian-oriented government. Just develop the ideas and look for the opportunities. And when opportunities arise, you know,
Right.
maybe you can take them.
And, you know, that's one of the major things we here at Center for Civil Society India try to do as well, you know, reach these ideas out to people and, you know, especially, and we hope that maybe someday there's a positive turn for these ideas and people recognize them on a large scale. One final question to you before we end this podcast, and that is, you served on Jeb Bush's Council of Economic Advisors from 2000 to 2006, right? And I found that quite interesting. So, you know, your tenure there, you know, how did it sort of reflect and sort of shape your views on state governance?
Yeah, that was an interesting time. Jeb Bush was a really smart guy, and he really knew issues. You know, so not only smart, but he was knowledgeable. And so when I was on his Council of Economic Advisors, he wasn't so much asking me for advice. We'd talk about issues and stuff, but rather, you know, he'd say, "I've looked at this issue. Here's what I want to do. What can you do to help me to accomplish my goals?" And I think that's a model that fits executive level decision making in general. And I'm thinking about, like in the United States, governors in states like Jeb Bush, like the President of the United States, as opposed to a legislature or a parliament. That in a legislature you have a lot of different people with a lot of different views, and so policy advisors there, you get different policy advice because different legislators, different parties have different initiatives. So you get a variety of policy views. In the executive branch of government, it's the chief executive. Everybody works for the chief executive. So their policies are the executive branch policies. And one thing I think I did notice as Jeb Bush, he served 8 years as governor. And one thing that I think I noticed with him, and I think this generalizes to other politicians, is the longer they're in power, the more they want to use that power to further some agenda. And I don't want to say, I think Jeb Bush, his motivations were good, that he wanted to do what was best for the state of Florida. But when he first became governor, it was more of a hands-off approach. And toward the end of his terms, more and more he wanted to be an activist governor.
Okay.
So you get that power, and the longer you have it, the more you want to use it.
Okay. So I think we have come towards the end of the podcast. Do you have any final thoughts to share, maybe?
I would just say, when you're looking at what you think government can do for you, if we go back to that idea, that wishful thinking, we should have the government do it. And there are really two things you need to consider in looking at that: information and incentives. That a lot of times government doesn't have, the people in government don't have enough information to get to the optimal allocation of resources, right? So the information might not be there. So you can draw a model on the board, here's the optimum, but the information that you need, people might not have it. One time I was struck by this was a recession after 2008. And in the United States, there was a massive amount of government spending that tried to prop up the economy, sort of Keynesian type government spending. And the economy was slow to recover. And some macroeconomists were saying, see, we didn't spend enough. We need more stimulus. And other economists were saying, no, the problem is government is interfering with the recovery. So in my comment, I'm not going to take sides on that. What I'm going to say is, here are experts who are disagreeing with each other. We don't have the information to know what the optimal policy is. And the second thing, incentives. That even if we have the information, politicians, bureaucrats may not have the incentive to do what's optimal. So, that's what we want to think about, taking a public choice approach. Okay, what can the government do? Do they have the information sufficient to make an improvement? And if they do they have the incentive? So my last two words, information and incentives.
Thank you, Professor, for being so generous with your time with us. I'd like to also thank the viewers who are watching this, and let's call it a day. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.